Hey there, survivors. It's David here. Thanks for tuning in to tonight's episode. If you're new here, please consider subscribing. It really helps me keep these stories coming. And while you're here, let me know in the comments where you're listening from. Now, let's get started.
Thanks for stopping by. When our channel reaches 1,000 subscribers, we're launching a lottery giveaway, and one new subscriber will win an iPhone 17 Pro Max. Subscribe now and be in the race before it's too late. My plan was simple enough. I wanted to restore the lighthouse because it was unfinished, not because it was isolated. I had spent years fixing things that were abstract, digital, endlessly revised. The lighthouse was concrete. Stone, rusted iron, salt-scarred stairs. It had survived neglect, storms, and bureaucratic indifference. Working on it felt like choosing something that would resist reinterpretation. I believed permanence could still be built, one deliberate action. I found the listing buried in an archive of municipal assets, photographed once and forgotten. The tower stood on a narrow stretch of coast where access required timing, patience, and weather cooperation. That difficulty appealed to me. Restoration meant learning limits, not bypassing them. Every visit required planning, physical effort, and acceptance that progress would be slow. Slowness felt honest. I wasn't looking for escape. I was looking for weight. I told people it was a personal project, which was true but incomplete. I needed something that didn't react instantly to attention. The lighthouse didn't respond to enthusiasm or neglect. It waited. That patience felt corrective. I could measure days by progress made with my hands, not by messages returned or meetings attended. Even setbacks carried evidence of effort. Rust flaked, bolts resisted, paint failed. Each failure taught me restraint. I moved into the keeper's quarters with limited expectations. Power was inconsistent, water dependent on careful use. None of that bothered me. I wanted proximity to the structure, not comfort. Nights were shaped by wind against glass, foghorns in the distance, and the slow rotation of the beam once I restored it. Sleep came unevenly, but purpose steadied me. I woke each day with clear intent, something rare before. The coast itself felt dependable. Tides arrived when they should. Fishing boats passed on predictable schedules. Radios crackled with routine exchanges. Isolation existed, but it was porous, buffered by distance and infrastructure. I could reach people if needed. That assumption mattered. I wasn't withdrawing from the world. I was repositioning within it. The lighthouse sat above it all, observing without interfering. That vantage felt not defensive. Nothing there was fragile. I spent weeks repairing what others had ignored. Corroded rails, seized gears, fractured steps. The work demanded attention, not force. I learned how easily impatience caused damage. Progress came through alignment, leverage, and pause. That discipline extended beyond tools. I stopped rushing conclusions. The lighthouse rewarded consistency, not urgency. Each repair held its place against weather. That resistance felt symbolic, like proof that things improved when left alone long enough. I documented progress with photos, notes, measurements. Not for sharing, but for accountability. The lighthouse didn't care about my reasons. It responded only to accuracy. That impartiality appealed to me. Modern systems constantly negotiate meaning. This place did not. Steel either fit or failed. Light either rotated or stalled. That clarity simplified responsibility. Mistakes were visible, not obscured. I could correct them without explanation. That freedom felt earned through effort. Contact with the mainland remained casual. Supply deliveries arrived when scheduled. Harbour traffic moved as expected. I listened to weather reports, not news. The larger world stayed abstract, distant enough to ignore. I didn't track headlines. Nothing seemed urgent. The coast functioned as it always had, predictable in its variations. That reliability reinforced my belief that stepping away hadn't cost me awareness. I thought I was choosing clarity, not blindness. Restoration wasn't nostalgia. I didn't want to preserve the lighthouse as it had been. I wanted it functional, present, accountable. The beam mattered because it served others, even if I rarely saw them. Light implies responsibility. You don't aim it for yourself. I took that seriously. Fixing the mechanism felt like participating in continuity, maintaining something larger than preference. At the time, I believed service required stability, not vigilance alone. I didn't consider how visible that service made me. I assumed the lighthouse existed outside consequence, a fixed symbol in a stable system. That belief shaped my planning. I prepared for decay, not disruption. I thought time was the only adversary. Standing there, restoring something meant to warn others. I never imagined needing warning myself. The coast felt permanent. My role felt chosen. I didn't understand how both could change. Life at the lighthouse organized itself around forces that didn't negotiate. Tide charts replaced calendars. Weather dictated pace more than intention ever had. I learned quickly that planning meant listening first. Wind direction determined which repairs were possible. Swell height decided whether I could leave or had to stay. The structure didn't resist this arrangement. It was built for it. I adapted because I had no reason not to. Mornings began before the sun cleared the horizon. I climbed the spiral stairs out of habit, not obligation, checking seals, lenses, and the slow rotation of the light. Salt crept into everything. Metal demanded constant attention. I learned which sounds meant adjustment and which meant patience. The lighthouse communicated in subtle ways. A vibration slightly out of rhythm, a hesitation in the gearing. These weren't failures, they were warnings given early enough to matter. The coast itself provided consistency. Fishing vessels passed at intervals I could predict within minutes. Their engines formed a background pattern that reassured me more than conversation ever had. Radios carried familiar voices, exchanging mundane information. Nothing dramatic, nothing urgent. That ordinariness anchored me. It suggested continuity beyond my immediate view. I wasn't alone, just elevated. Isolation came in degrees, not absolutes. I could walk the path down to the landing when conditions allowed. Supply boats arrived with quiet regularity. The harbour master checked in occasionally, more out of protocol than concern. I never felt cut off. Distance felt intentional, calibrated. Enough separation to work uninterrupted, not enough to be forgotten. Meals followed the same logic. I ate when the work paused, not when a clock suggested it. Cooking simplified itself. Food tasted better without hurry. Even cleanup felt different. Tasks ended when they were finished, not when attention drifted. That completeness affected everything else. I stopped multitasking. One action at a time felt sufficient. Evenings belonged to observation. I'd sit near the windows watching the coastline settle. Light shifted across rock faces, revealing textures that disappeared at noon. Fog rolled in low and patient, erasing depth without warning. The beam cut through it methodically, unchanged by obstruction. I trusted that motion. Its repetition grounded me. Sleep came in uneven segments. Wind sometimes rattled frames. Waves struck rock with varying force. These sounds didn't disrupt rest, they structured it. I learned to wake without alarm, attentive rather than startled. Dreams stretched, unbroken by notifications or artificial urgency. When I woke, I knew where I was immediately. That clarity felt earned. Communication remained present but secondary. I checked messages when signal allowed, responded without pressure. Conversations with friends felt distant, not strained. They asked about progress, weather, solitude. I answered honestly but briefly. The lighthouse didn't translate well into casual description. It required context I wasn't interested in providing yet. I stopped following news cycles without consciously deciding to. Headlines felt irrelevant from this vantage. The coast taught me scale differently. Storms mattered more than politics. Tides carried more consequence than speculation. I trusted that anything important would reach me through official channels or direct contact. That trust rested on the assumption that systems worked even when I wasn't watching them. Maintenance filled the gaps. I repainted sections where salt had stripped layers away. I replaced worn seals, reinforced joints, cleared drainage paths. Each task contributed to stability. The lighthouse rewarded attention by functioning smoothly. That feedback loop reinforced my belief that diligence prevented failure. I thought prevention was the same as preparedness. The beam became my constant. Night after night, it traced the same arc across water and rock. I rarely thought about who relied on it. Knowing someone did felt enough. Responsibility didn't feel heavy when shared by routine. I was maintaining continuity, not guarding against collapse. Looking back, the rhythm lulled me into confidence. Patterns repeated reliably. Variations stayed within expected bounds. I learned the coast so well that deviations felt unlikely. Familiarity became its own form of insulation. I mistook predictability for permanence. The lighthouse had stood for decades. The sea followed rules. People followed schedules. Nothing suggested that alignment could dissolve quickly. I believed the hardest part of restoration was behind me. The structure was stabilizing. Systems worked. My role felt defined. I was living inside a rhythm that rewarded attention and patience. It didn't prepare me for interruption. It taught me consistency, not adaptability. At the time, that felt like enough. The first sign didn't arrive as chaos. It showed up as delay. A supply delivery that should have appeared by mid-morning didn't. I stood on the upper platform watching the water longer than necessary, tracking the empty stretch where the boat usually emerged. Weather was clear. Swell mild. Nothing explained the absence, so I supplied my own explanation and moved on. Later that day, a radio call went unanswered. Not cut off, not distorted. Just unanswered. I waited through the expected window, listening to the static breathe between attempts. Silence on open channels isn't rare, but it usually carries timing. This didn't. It lingered longer than it should have, then resolved without response. I noted it mentally and returned to work. Irregularities stacked quietly. A maintenance update I expected never arrived. An automated system notification repeated outdated information instead of refreshing. These weren't failures in isolation. They were small fractures that didn't propagate the way real problems do. Each one felt self-contained, easy to ignore if you weren't looking for patterns. I told myself this was administrative lag, seasonal staffing changes, technical glitches, coastal operations run on margins that absorb inconsistency. I had worked around enough delays to know not every disruption carries meaning. Experience can teach patience, but it can also teach dismissal. That evening I scanned maritime frequencies out of habit. Traffic was lighter than usual, not empty, just thin. Fewer overlapping voices. Longer gaps between exchanges. The sea remained calm, offering no urgency to contradict the quiet. I took that as confirmation that nothing significant was happening. If there had been trouble, someone would have said something. The next morning brought another omission. A weather update failed to cycle. The previous day's report remained on loop, uncorrected by new data. Conditions had changed slightly overnight. The report hadn't. I checked the instruments manually. Pressure had shifted, wind direction adjusted, and the system should have updated. It hadn't. That discrepancy unsettled me briefly, then receded. I adjusted my plans manually and continued repairs. Direct observation has always mattered more than forecasts. The lighthouse didn't require commentary to function. It required alignment. I trusted my senses over feeds and channels. Still, the gaps persisted. harbour chatter dropped further. No casual check-ins, no routine acknowledgements. When a voice did break through, it sounded clipped, transactional, stripped of the small talk that usually padded exchanges. Conversations ended quickly, without clarification or follow-up. I began double-checking things I'd never questioned before. Fuel levels, backup systems, redundancy I hadn't needed yet. None of it showed immediate risk. Everything worked within expected parameters. That consistency dulled my concern. If systems function, problems must be elsewhere. The coast looked unchanged. Birds followed familiar paths. Waves broke at the same points along the rocks. Boats appeared occasionally, though fewer than before. I watched one pass farther offshore than usual, moving quickly without adjusting course toward the harbour. I wondered about it for a moment, then let the thought dissolve. I didn't record any of this formally. It didn't feel worth documenting. Documentation implies significance. At the time, these were anomalies without consequence, not events, just absences. Absences don't demand response unless you believe they will persist. That belief never formed fully. I assumed normalization would follow disruption. That assumption had always been rewarded before. Systems correct themselves, patterns reassert, delay resolves. I had no reason to believe this time was different. What I didn't understand yet was that early collapse doesn't announce itself through failure. It announces itself through erosion. Functions degrade without triggering alarms. Communication thins without severing completely. The structure remains upright while support weakens underneath. Standing there, adjusting equipment that responded exactly as it should, I felt reassured by functionality. The lighthouse didn't care about missed messages or quiet channels. It rotated. It illuminated. It held position against wind and tide. That reliability masked instability elsewhere. I dismissed the irregularities because nothing immediate demanded correction. No alarm forced action. No directive changed my routine. The coast continued offering cues that everything remained within bounds. I trusted those cues because they had never misled me before. In retrospect, that trust was the real irregularity. I was accustomed to reacting to presence, not absence. I hadn't learned how to interpret silence as data. The first signs asked for interpretation, not action. I answered them with patience instead. By the time patience stopped being appropriate, the pattern had already established itself. The quiet had become structural. At that point, dismissal wasn't a choice anymore. It was a habit I had trained myself into, one that would cost me clarity when I needed it most. The silence didn't build gradually after that. It arrived in a single, unmistakable absence. I woke expecting the low murmur of engines offshore, the kind that usually bled into the lighthouse through stone and glass before sunrise. Instead, there was nothing. No mechanical hum, no radio bleed, just wind moving across open water without interruption. I checked the radio immediately. Not because I expected news, but because routine demanded it. The channels were open, technically alive, yet empty. No overlapping voices, no corrections, no idle chatter filling space between tasks. I waited longer than usual before speaking, as if interrupting might break something. When I finally transmitted a routine check, my voice sounded out of place. It went unanswered. Outside, the sea looked unchanged. Swell moved in predictable sets. Light reflected cleanly across the surface. The beam rotated as it always had, cutting its measured arc through air that offered no resistance. Visually, nothing suggested disruption. That disconnect unsettled me more than obvious damage would have. Disorder usually leaves marks. This left none. By mid-morning, the absence became harder to rationalize. No boats passed within range. Not one. Even on the quietest days, someone transits the coast. Fishing schedules shift, but they don't vanish. Recreational traffic drops midweek, but commercial movement persists. That continuity had been reliable for years. Its sudden disappearance created a vacuum my mind kept trying to fill. I scanned farther out, adjusting lenses, widening focus. The horizon remained empty longer than it should have. When something finally appeared, it stayed distant, moving parallel to the coast without adjusting course toward harbor or marker. It didn't slow. It didn't signal. It simply passed through, as if the shoreline no longer existed as a point of reference. Attempts to reach inland contacts failed quietly. Calls didn't drop. They ended before beginning. Data connections stalled without error. Systems behaved as though nothing were wrong while providing nothing useful. That neutrality was disorienting. I'd prepared for storms, outages, mechanical faults. Those failures announced themselves. This didn't. The lighthouse amplified the quiet. Sound carried farther without competing noise. Waves striking rock sounded sharper. Wind across the platform felt exposed, as if there were fewer surfaces to interrupt it. Even my own movement seemed louder. I became aware of how much noise I generated simply by existing there. I walked the grounds repeatedly, not because I expected change, but because movement helped me think. The path to the landing was undisturbed. No new footprints, no signs of recent use. Supplies scheduled for delivery remained absent without explanation. That bothered me more than if they'd been cancelled outright. Cancellation implies communication. This implied disappearance. By afternoon, the quiet felt coordinated, not intentional in a sentient sense, but systemic. Multiple channels had fallen silent at once. Independent functions failed together without sharing a cause I could identify. That convergence removed coincidence from the list of explanations. Patterns were forming whether I wanted them to or not. I listened longer than necessary, straining for anything out of place. The coast had always been noisy if you paid attention. Distant engines, radio bleed, human presence layered into the environment. Now the landscape sounded stripped. Natural elements remained. Human ones did not. I considered leaving to check the harbour directly, then dismissed it. There was no urgency yet, no confirmed threat. Acting prematurely felt irresponsible. I told myself that rushing toward uncertainty without information created risk rather than reducing it. That logic had always served me well. Evening brought no change. Sunset usually coincided with increased traffic as boats returned. That pattern didn't reappear. Darkness settled without ceremony. The beam continued rotating into emptiness, serving an audience that wasn't responding. I logged the day formally for the first time. Not speculation, just observations. Fewer boats. No radio traffic. Failed connections. Writing it down forced me to acknowledge continuity in the absence. This wasn't a bad hour. It was a full cycle without correction. That night, sleep came in fragments. Not because of fear, but because anticipation had nowhere to resolve. I kept expecting sound to return, engines restarting, voices overlapping again. Each expectation expired quietly, replaced by another. The coast hadn't gone silent gradually. It had withdrawn. The distinction mattered. Silence implies stillness. Withdrawal implies movement away from something. I didn't know what it was moving from or toward, only that it wasn't temporary. The lighthouse felt suddenly prominent, exposed by contrast. A single point of function surrounded by non-response. I stood near the window watching the beams sweep empty water and understood that isolation had changed shape. It was no longer personal or chosen. It was structural. Whatever had happened hadn't reached me directly yet, but the quiet confirmed that it had reached everything else. The confirmation came from height, not proximity. That felt cruel in hindsight. The lighthouse gave me range, clarity, and time to understand what I was seeing without the mercy of distance. I was adjusting the lens shortly after sunrise when movement along the shoreline caught my attention. Not because it was dramatic, but because it lacked rhythm. People move with intention even when they're lost. They hesitate, correct, pause. This movement did none of that. It drifted, then lurched, covering ground without purpose. I steadied the binoculars and followed it as it emerged from behind a collapsed storage shed near the harbour road. The figure wasn't running. It wasn't walking either. Its posture leaned forward unnaturally, arms hanging in a way that suggested they weren't being used for balance. I waited for context to resolve the image into something reasonable. A drunk, an injury, a trick of distance. None of those explanations held once the figure reached open ground. I lowered the binoculars briefly, not to look away, but to confirm that my eyes weren't straining. When I raised them again, the movement had worsened. The person stumbled, dropped to one knee, then pushed upright without reacting to the impact. Pain usually interrupts motion. This didn't. No one came to meet them. No vehicle slowed, no door opened. The harbour area remained inactive, abandoned in a way that felt deliberate rather than coincidental. That absence sharpened the scene into something undeniable. I tracked the figure longer than I should have, long enough to notice details I didn't want to catalogue. The uneven drag of one foot, the delayed response to obstacles, the way the head snapped towards sound instead of sight when a gull took off nearby. These weren't injuries behaving badly. They were behaviours operating under a different priority. I stepped back from the glass and felt something settle in my chest that wasn't panic. It was recognition without name. I had seen footage before, scattered across screens in other contexts, always framed as distance or spectacle. Those images never carried weight because they were curated. This wasn't curated. It was happening in real time, under light I controlled. When I returned to the window, the figure had reached the waterline. It stood there without reacting to the tide pushing against its legs. Waves broke around it, soaking clothes that didn't prompt a retreat or adjustment. After a moment that stretched too long, it fell forward into the surf. I waited for someone to respond. A shout. A siren. Anything. Nothing arrived. The body remained where it fell, shifting only with the pull of water. I couldn't see the face clearly, but I didn't need to. Stillness didn't imply resolution anymore. It implied interruption. My radio stayed silent. No emergency channel activated. No alert tone followed. Systems that should have reacted didn't acknowledge what was happening below them. That non-response confirmed what movement alone suggested. This wasn't an isolated incident. It was a condition. I scanned farther down the coast, widening focus beyond the harbour. More movement appeared in places that should have been empty. Not clustered. Not coordinated. Just present. Figures emerging briefly from behind structures, then disappearing again. None of them interacted. None of them behaved as if others mattered. The lighthouse no longer felt like a place of observation. It felt like a perch I hadn't asked for. Height magnifies patterns. Once you see one anomaly, others line up behind it, demanding interpretation. I couldn't unsee what I was tracking now. I stepped away and closed the shutters halfway, not for protection, but to break line of sight. I needed a pause to recalibrate. That instinct surprised me. I hadn't reacted emotionally to the image itself. I reacted to what it implied about response failure. When I returned to the window, the shoreline looked calmer again. Movement had slipped out of view. The sea resumed its ordinary behaviour. That normalcy felt false, like a stage reset after a scene change. I sat down and reviewed what information I actually had. Confirmed movement. Absent response. Systemic silence. The combination removed ambiguity. Whatever had happened inland or elsewhere had reached the coast already. It just hadn't reached me physically yet. The realization didn't arrive as fear. It arrived as obligation. The lighthouse existed to warn others of danger they couldn't see. For the first time since I began restoration, I understood that the danger was no longer maritime. The beam still rotated, performing its function perfectly, But the threat had shifted inland, operating outside the purpose the structure was built for. From that height, I wasn't safe. I was exposed to truth earlier than most. Visibility didn't grant control. It granted responsibility without tools to act on it. I understood then that the quiet I'd been experiencing wasn't delay. It was aftermath. Whatever had caused the collapse had already passed through the systems I trusted, leaving behind gaps that couldn't be filled by observation alone. The coast hadn't gone silent because nothing was happening. It had gone silent because the mechanisms that responded to events like this no longer existed, and I was standing in a lighthouse watching consequences unfold, with no one left to notify. Height used to feel like distance. Standing above the coast gave me time to notice changes before they mattered. That assumption unraveled once I understood what visibility actually cost. From the lantern room, I could see farther than anyone below, but seeing didn't translate into options. It translated into waiting while consequences approached without a way to redirect them. The lighthouse had been built to observe ships, not people. Its elevation favored warning over defense. I could identify movement, track direction, estimate timing, and do nothing useful with that information. Every figure I spotted along the shoreline became a problem I could anticipate but not resolve. Anticipation without agency is a particular kind of strain. I tested the limits of height methodically. I traced approach paths with binoculars, marking how long it would take someone to move from the harbour road to the base of the bluff. I noted where terrain narrowed, where cover disappeared, where sound would carry upward. The higher I stood, the clearer it became terrain that elevation simplified perspective while complicating response. Distance delayed contact, but it also concentrated it. Anyone approaching had limited routes. That clarity felt reassuring for a moment, until I realized it worked both ways. My position was equally obvious. The beam announced presence every night, a rotating declaration that something functional remained here. I had restored visibility without considering who might be looking for it. I shut the light down once, just to test the effect. Darkness swallowed the upper platform immediately. The absence felt wrong, like neglect, but also relieving. Without the beam, the lighthouse receded into the coastline instead of asserting itself. I turned it back on within minutes. Habit and responsibility overruled caution, even as doubt settled deeper. Sleep changed first. From the keeper's room, every sound from below felt directional. Waves against rock sounded like footsteps when filtered through anticipation. Wind shifted unpredictably around the tower, catching edges I hadn't noticed before. Height amplified noise instead of dampening it. I woke more often, not from fear but from calculation. I considered barricading access points, then abandoned the idea. Stone resists force poorly when channeled. Narrow stairwells become liabilities if pressure builds. The structure offered no meaningful fallback positions. Once someone reached the base, height would no longer matter. It would trap me above problems I couldn't descend past. The sea stopped feeling like separation. From above, I could see how easily someone could follow the shoreline until it curved beneath the bluff. Tides changed access subtly, exposing paths that weren't visible from ground level. My vantage revealed vulnerabilities rather than protection. Knowledge increased risk awareness without reducing exposure. I thought about abandoning the upper levels, living closer to ground, trading sight for mobility. That idea carried its own cost. Lowering myself meant surrendering early warning entirely. Every option removed something essential. Height offered information, ground offered movement. I couldn't have both. What unsettled me most was how quickly the symbolism inverted. Elevation had meant oversight, authority, calm. Now it meant isolation and delay. I was watching outcomes I couldn't influence, counting minutes that didn't belong to me. The lighthouse hadn't failed structurally. Its purpose had expired. I stopped standing in the lantern room for long periods. Prolonged observation tightened my thinking instead of sharpening it. I limited checks to specific intervals, forcing myself to disengage between them. Constant sightlines didn't improve readiness. They eroded it. Height no longer felt like protection. It felt like exposure stretched over time. Every advantage came paired with a consequence that mattered more. The lighthouse had lifted me above immediate danger while removing my ability to adapt quickly. That trade-off wasn't sustainable. I accepted then that remaining elevated wasn't neutral. It shaped outcomes by delaying decisions until fewer options remained. The higher I stayed, the less flexible I became. Safety had shifted from being a matter of position to one of timing, and height, I realized, only ever buys time, never resolution. I understood the cost clearly, finally, and chose awareness over comfort, knowing vigilance demanded movement later, not now, and that clinging to elevation would postpone decisions until danger dictated them without consent when circumstances shifted beyond my ability to choose freely. Once I stopped pretending the lighthouse was a refuge, I began seeing it for what it actually was, a tool built for a specific purpose in a world that no longer existed. It could illuminate, it could elevate, it could endure weather that flattened lesser structures. What it could not do was adapt without intervention. Every advantage it offered came with conditions I had never needed to examine before. Power was the first illusion to fracture. The lighthouse wasn't self-sufficient in the way I'd casually assumed. It depended on a patch system of aging lines, backup batteries, and a generator designed for short outages, not sustained isolation. Fuel was finite. Maintenance assumed access to parts that were no longer moving along the coast. I could keep the light turning for now, but for now had become a dangerously vague unit of time. Water existed, but only because I managed it carefully. Collection systems worked when weather cooperated. Storage required constant attention. A single miscalculation could turn abundance into scarcity quickly. The lighthouse had never been intended as living quarters. It tolerated habitation the way stone tolerates moss, without enthusiasm and without support. Food storage was worse. Space was limited. Preservation options were narrow. I had planned restoration trips measured in weeks, not survival measured in unknowns. Canned goods stretched possibility, not certainty. Every meal became a decision shaped by how far I was willing to borrow from the future. The structure itself imposed constraints I hadn't felt until pressure arrived. Narrow stairwells restricted movement. Rooms stacked vertically rather than spreading horizontally. Retreat routes overlapped with access points. Once compromised, the lighthouse would not offer layers of defense. It would funnel everything upward, including me. Tools were plentiful in one sense and insufficient in another. I had what was needed to fix corrosion, realign mechanisms, reinforce joints. I did not have what was needed to respond to sustained threat. Restoration tools assume patience. Survival demands contingency. The overlap between those two is smaller than I'd believed. Visibility remained its strongest asset, but even that carried diminishing returns. Seeing farther did not mean reaching farther. I could observe changes along the coast without influencing them. Information accumulated without outlets. The lighthouse provided awareness without agency, which drained resolve faster than ignorance ever had. What surprised me most was how quickly comfort dissolved once it was measured against endurance. A bed exists. That doesn't mean rest will come. Walls exist. That doesn't mean safety follows. Shelter, I learned, is not defined by enclosure but by options. The lighthouse enclosed me thoroughly while limiting every exit. I tested contingencies carefully, timed how long it took to descend fully loaded, counted steps, noted bottlenecks, imagined worst cases without dramatizing them. Planning stripped romance from the structure. Stone doesn't negotiate. Iron doesn't forgive error. Once a mistake happens inside a vertical system, recovery narrows. The lighthouse could warn others, but there was no one left to warn in the way it was designed to. That realization undercut its original purpose. Service without audience becomes maintenance for its own sake. I kept the beam running, not because it would save anyone, but because stopping it felt like surrendering continuity altogether. What the lighthouse couldn't provide became clearer than what it could. It couldn't move, it couldn't hide, it couldn't scale with changing conditions. It demanded that the world adapt around it, an expectation the coast had already rejected. I wasn't ungrateful for what it offered. Without the lighthouse, I would have known less, and later. Height had given me time to adjust mentally before the threat arrived physically. That mattered, but time spent without flexibility becomes debt. Eventually, it demands payment. By the end of that assessment, I understood the truth plainly. The lighthouse could support observation, short-term survival, and limited isolation. It could not support permanence under collapse. It wasn't a fortress. It wasn't a sanctuary. It was a vantage point with an expiration date. Accepting that didn't feel like defeat. It felt like accuracy. The structure hadn't failed me. I had misread its role. Once corrected, planning became more honest. I stopped asking what the lighthouse could do for me and started asking how long it would allow me to decide what came next. That shift marked the end of restoration thinking. From that point forward, every action served transition, not preservation. The decision didn't arrive suddenly. It formed the way pressure forms in sealed spaces, invisible until it forces release. Observation had kept me informed, but it had also kept me static. I knew more than I could act on. That imbalance became intolerable once I understood that knowledge without movement only delays consequence. I noticed it first in how I checked the coastline. What began as curiosity had hardened into routine surveillance. I wasn't watching to learn anymore. I was watching to confirm that things were still wrong. That repetition didn't increase readiness. It narrowed it. The lighthouse had turned me into a witness when I needed to be a participant. Staying elevated preserved distance but consumed opportunity. Every hour spent above the coast was an hour not spent understanding conditions at ground level. Patterns seen from height lacked texture. I could track movement but not intention. I could see outcomes but not causes. That gap mattered. Survival depends on context, not just awareness. I resisted the idea of leaving longer than I should have. Movement felt like escalation, and escalation carries risk. But so does delay. I realized that by remaining in place, I was accepting a single future shaped entirely by external forces. Leaving would introduce uncertainty, but it would also introduce choice. Choice had become the scarce resource. I began preparing without announcing it to myself. Supplies shifted from storage to accessibility. Tools were reorganized for transport rather than repair. I tested the landing path repeatedly, timing descent under load, adjusting for balance and speed. These actions framed the decision before I admitted it existed. The lighthouse resisted departure in subtle ways. Every task left unfinished felt heavier. Every repaired section reminded me of intent abandoned midstream. I hadn't come here to leave. I had come to restore something stable. Accepting that stability no longer applied required letting go of a version of myself that believed effort guaranteed outcome. I chose a narrow objective. Not escape, not rescue, information. I needed to know how far the collapse extended and what forms it had taken nearby. Height gave overview, not detail. Detail required proximity. That meant stepping into spaces where prediction failed. I waited for conditions that reduced exposure without eliminating risk. Overcast skies muted contrast, wind distorted sound, tides lowered access points that would normally funnel movement. None of that made the decision safe. It made it possible without immediate disadvantage. Before leaving, I shut the beam down again. This time, I left it dark. The absence felt deliberate rather than negligent. Without the light, the lighthouse became less of a signal and more of a structure. I didn't know whether that would matter, but uncertainty no longer justified inaction. Descending the stairs with a pack on my shoulders changed how the space felt. The narrow, spiral, compressed movement, reminding me how easily retreat could become obstruction. Every step downward increased commitment. Turning back would have been easier than proceeding, which told me the decision had already matured. At the base, the air felt different, heavier, less filtered. Sounds arrived without delay. I could hear water moving against rock with immediate feedback. The coast no longer existed as a panorama. It existed as fragments within reach. I paused longer than necessary before stepping away from the structure. Not from fear, but from recalibration. The lighthouse had shaped my thinking for weeks. Leaving it meant releasing the illusion that oversight equaled safety. On the ground, mistakes would matter faster. That reality sharpened focus instead of dulling it. I moved along the shoreline carefully, favoring routes that allowed retreat without commitment. Every detail mattered now. Footing, cover, sound direction. The coast revealed information I'd never see from above. Drag marks near access paths, abandoned gear left in haste, signs of movement that hadn't registered as patterns from height. The further I went, the clearer it became that observation alone had concealed urgency. Conditions weren't static. They were actively deteriorating. Systems hadn't paused. They had failed forward, reshaping behavior everywhere except where I'd been standing. I didn't encounter anyone immediately. That absence carried its own message. People weren't congregating. They were dispersing. Movement was directional, not random. That understanding wouldn't have surfaced without proximity. Breaking observation didn't make me safer, it made me accurate. Accuracy replaced comfort as the priority. I understood then that returning to the lighthouse unchanged wasn't the goal. The goal was to decide whether returning at all made sense. When I finally turned back toward the structure, it looked smaller than it had from above. Not diminished, just contextualized. One element in a landscape that no longer centered itself around fixed points. Leaving hadn't solved anything. It had rebalanced my position in the problem. I was no longer waiting for events to reach me. I was moving within them. That shift marked the true beginning of survival. Not because danger increased, but because denial finally ended. The first confirmation didn't come from sight. It came from interruption. A trail I expected to continue cleanly toward the inlet was broken by disturbance that hadn't been there days earlier. The ground was scuffed unevenly, not by weather, but by repeated weight shifting without purpose. I crouched and pressed my palm into the sand. It hadn't settled yet. Whatever passed through hadn't gone far. I slowed immediately. Empty spaces announced themselves through consistency. This space didn't. Small details contradicted each other. A piece of rope lay coiled neatly near a rock, deliberate and careful. 10 steps later, the same rope type was frayed and abandoned, cut rather than untied. That contrast told a story of intention interrupted. Farther along the coast, I found gear that didn't belong to the lighthouse. A pack leaned against driftwood, positioned rather than discarded. It held items chosen under pressure, not leisure. Water containers mismatched, food stripped of packaging. A radio with the antenna snapped short, not broken by accident but by impact. Someone had prepared to move fast, not far. The absence of bodies mattered. There were no remains near the gear, no signs of struggle that resolved cleanly. That suggested motion continued after whatever caused the abandonment. People had passed through and kept going, which meant the coast was being used as a corridor rather than a destination. I followed signs cautiously, never long enough to commit to pursuit. Tracks overlapped and diverged, crossing in ways that made individual paths impossible to isolate. This wasn't one person moving alone. It was multiple groups passing through at different times, each leaving fragments without context. That complexity erased any illusion of solitude. A sound broke through the wind without warning. Not speech, not an engine. It was human, strained and directional. It ended abruptly, as if cut short rather than fading. Birds lifted from the rocks farther down the shoreline in response, their movement fast and disorganized. Whatever caused the sound had momentum. I didn't move toward it. Curiosity is expensive when information can be gathered indirectly. I waited, listening for continuation. None came. Silence returned, but it felt altered, like a surface stretched back over disturbance that hadn't settled underneath. I shifted position and scanned the area again, this time with the expectation of presence rather than absence. That change in framing made details surface faster. A door on a storage shed stood ajar when it should have swung shut with the wind. Fresh scrape marks ran along its frame at a height that suggested force applied without coordination. Near the waterline, I noticed drag patterns leading toward the surf, then stopping abruptly. The marks were shallow, inconsistent, and uncorrected. No attempt had been made to finish the task. Whatever had been moved became irrelevant partway through the effort. The realization arrived without drama. The coast wasn't abandoned. It was transitional. People were moving through it under pressure, not settling. Some were adapting. Some weren't. The lighthouse had been quiet, not because nothing was happening, but because activity had redistributed itself beyond predictable routes. That knowledge carried weight. Isolation had been an illusion created by elevation and distance. On the ground, the collapse had texture. It left behind decisions, mistakes, and traces of urgency. Each sign pointed away from stability and toward momentum. I backed away from the shoreline methodically, retracing steps with care. Information gathered was already sufficient. Confirmation doesn't require completeness. It requires contradiction of assumptions. Every assumption I'd held about emptiness had been disproven without confrontation. Returning towards the lighthouse, I felt the environment shift in my awareness. Every sound had potential origin now. Every object had history I hadn't witnessed. The coast no longer felt neutral. It felt used. By the time the tower came back into view, the truth had settled fully. I wasn't overlooking an empty coastline from a safe height. I was positioned above a moving system I'd only just entered. Others were navigating it with fewer resources and fewer options. Some were ahead of me. Some had already fallen behind. The proof didn't come with certainty about outcomes. It came with clarity about context. The lighthouse wasn't isolated from the collapse. It was simply late to register it. The coast had become a passageway shaped by pressure, and I was no longer observing that pressure from near distance. I had stepped into it. The encounter didn't begin with words. It began with adjustment. I noticed it while moving along the inland edge of the coast, where brush thickened enough to break sightlines. The environment shifted subtly, not through sound but through alignment. Something that should have been where it was yesterday was no longer there. Something else had taken its place. I stopped and waited. Waiting felt different now. It wasn't passive. It was deliberate restraint. I let time stretch until movement revealed itself through displacement rather than presence. A branch bent where no wind touched it. A shadow settled into a shape that wasn't natural. Whoever was there understood stillness as well as I did. When they stepped out, it was partial. Enough to be seen, not enough to be approached. Distance was preserved intentionally. That decision mattered more than any weapon would have. It told me this wasn't panic-driven behavior. It was practiced caution. We didn't point at each other. We didn't ask questions immediately. The silence between us was structured, shaped by assessment rather than fear. I kept my hands visible without exaggeration. They mirrored the gesture. That symmetry wasn't trust. It was recognition of shared risk. The first words exchanged were minimal. Names offered without context. Not real names, I suspected. Not false either. Something in between. A marker of identity without vulnerability. I did the same. Neither of us corrected pronunciation. Neither of us asked where the other came from. Conversation stayed narrow by design. We spoke about terrain conditions, tides, access routes that had changed. Each detail was specific enough to be useful, vague enough to remain safe. Information moved in short bursts, never accumulating into a full picture on either side. They mentioned others in passing, not as allies or threats, but as variables. Groups that moved fast and burned out, individuals who tried to hold ground and failed. The way it was phrased suggested experience without attachment. Survival had stripped sentiment from observation. I realized then that coordination had become expensive. Trust required time most people no longer had. Cooperation demanded shared objectives that no longer aligned naturally. Everyone was solving for themselves first, adjusting only when overlap became unavoidable. I asked one direct question: whether staying near the coast made sense anymore. The pause before the answer told me more than the answer itself. They didn't say no. They didn't say yes. They said it depended on what you were willing to give up to stay visible. That word lingered. Visible. I thought about the lighthouse, about the beam cutting through fog night after night, about how clearly it marked a position I could no longer defend without escalation. I hadn't mentioned it. They hadn't asked. That silence felt intentional. The interaction ended without resolution, no plans exchanged, no promises made. We stepped back in opposite directions, careful not to turn our backs until distance reasserted itself. There was no hostility in the withdrawal. There was no relief either. As I moved away, I understood what the encounter had clarified. Survival had fractured into parallel paths that intersected briefly, then diverged without merging. No central authority remained to pull trajectories together. Coordination would have to be earned repeatedly, under pressure, without guarantees. Returning towards the lighthouse, I felt the cost of visibility more sharply. Structures attract attention, even when they offer nothing. Light implies resources, elevation implies control. Assumptions form quickly when context is missing. The encounter hadn't made me safer or more endangered directly. It had adjusted my expectations. People weren't waiting to band together. They were waiting to see who lasted long enough to be worth the risk. I replayed the exchange as I climbed back toward the tower. Not the words, but the rhythm. The way distance was maintained. The way information was rationed. That was the new social contract. Not distrust, but caution refined into habit. From the lantern room, the coast looked unchanged again. Waves, rock, fog drifting low. But I could feel the difference now. Interaction had stripped away the illusion that coordination would emerge naturally under pressure. It wouldn't. It would have to be built deliberately, at cost, by people willing to accept exposure. I wasn't there yet. Neither were they. The lighthouse stood between us as a symbol neither of us named. It represented stability that no longer existed, and attention that no longer guaranteed help. That interaction didn't give me allies. It gave me context. From that point forward, I stopped expecting convergence. Survival, I realized, was no longer collective by default. It was conditional, negotiated moment by moment, between people who understood that proximity did not equal alignment. And the coast, once a shared boundary, had become a series of overlapping routes where interaction happened without coordination. An understanding arrived without comfort. The coastline changed without asking permission, not through catastrophe, but through adjustment. Tides that once exposed rock at predictable hours lingered longer than expected, swallowing paths I'd memorized. Water reached higher along the bluff, erasing margins I relied on for movement. Nothing dramatic announced the shift. It simply refused to behave the way it had before. Weather stopped following its familiar rhythm. Wind arrived from directions that rarely held for long. Fog rolled in unevenly, thick in some stretches and absent in others, breaking sight lines unpredictably. From the lighthouse, patterns that once repeated began to fragment. The coast still functioned, but not reliably enough to trust. Access points changed character. Narrow paths that once funneled movement became muddy traps after sustained moisture. Other areas hardened unexpectedly, offering passage where there had been resistance. These shifts weren't improvements or losses. They were reconfigurations, and they happened faster than memory could keep you up with. Sound carried differently too. On some mornings, distant movement travelled upward with unnatural clarity. On others, nearby disturbances dissolved before reaching the tower. Direction became harder to judge. Distance stopped correlating with volume. I found myself hesitating longer, trying to interpret cues that no longer matched experience. Debris patterns along the shore told the same story. Items washed in from elsewhere appeared more frequently, suggesting upstream disruption. The sea wasn't delivering objects randomly. It was redistributing consequences. Each unfamiliar piece of wreckage hinted at failures beyond the horizon I could no longer verify. The lighthouse's charts grew less useful. Markers still existed, but the assumptions beneath them didn't. Safe approaches narrowed, risky routes widened. I updated notes repeatedly, then stopped trusting them. The coast wasn't stable enough to document accurately. By the time something was recorded, it had already changed. Movement along the shoreline increased in ways that didn't align with previous traffic. Tracks appeared where there shouldn't have been any. Some led nowhere. Others overlapped repeatedly, suggesting hesitation rather than transit. The coast had become a negotiation zone rather than a corridor. I adjusted my behavior without realizing it at first. I stopped committing to routes early. I paused more often, listening instead of moving. Decisions became provisional. Everything was subject to revision based on the next observation. Certainty eroded quietly, replaced by constant recalibration. What unsettled me most was how ordinary the change felt once it settled in. There was no single moment when predictability vanished. It thinned until it couldn't support planning anymore. The coast hadn't become hostile. It had become unreliable, which was worse. I thought about how much of survival depends on environmental memory. Knowing how a place behaves under pressure, that knowledge decays when conditions shift faster than learning can adapt. I was watching that decay in real time, unable to slow it. The lighthouse remained fixed, an unmoving reference point in a landscape that no longer referenced itself consistently. That contrast sharpened the problem. Stability in one element doesn't compensate for volatility everywhere else. It can even mask it. By the end of that day, I stopped thinking of the coast as something to be learned. It was something to be interpreted continuously. Past experience no longer guaranteed future accuracy. Every assumption required verification. The realization didn't bring fear. It brought humility. The environment was no longer a backdrop. It was an active variable, reshaping outcomes without regard for intention. Predictability had been the last comfort I hadn't questioned. Once it was gone, the lighthouse felt less like an anchor and more like a witness to change accelerating beyond my ability to catalogue it. From that point on, I stopped asking what the coast would do next. I started asking whether I could respond fast enough when it did. The plan formed without optimism. It wasn't built on the idea of reaching safety, only on the need to stop standing still. Remaining at the lighthouse had narrowed my thinking until every solution curved back to endurance. Endurance keeps you alive, but it doesn't expand options. I needed options, even if they came with risk. I structured the plan around subtraction. What I could abandon mattered more than what I could carry. The tower itself would stay. Most tools would stay. Anything that tied me to restoration rather than movement became excess. I packed for continuity, not comfort. Water, compact food, navigation aids that didn't rely on signal, a minimal first aid kit chosen for versatility rather than completeness. timing mattered more than direction. I waited for conditions that blurred intent. Overcast skies flattened contrast. Wind scattered sound. Tides lowered enough to expose routes that wouldn't funnel movement toward obvious paths. I didn't want speed. I wanted ambiguity. Leaving unnoticed mattered more than leaving quickly. Before departing, I walked the lighthouse one last time with intention, not sentiment. I checked systems I wouldn't use again, not to preserve them, but to understand what I was relinquishing. The structure stood as it always had. Solid, unmoved by my reassessment. That indifference helped. It made the decision cleaner. I left the beam dark. Not temporarily, permanently, as far as I could determine. The absence didn't feel dramatic. It felt procedural, like closing a ledger after the final entry. The lighthouse shifted from responsibility to reference, something that could orient me later without demanding return. The descent felt different than previous ones. Lighter, but also irreversible. Each step downward marked distance from certainty rather than height. I moved deliberately, controlling noise, pacing breath. Nothing followed. No reaction met the choice. That silence was either luck or delay. I didn't try to classify it. The route followed the coast briefly, then angled inland through terrain that resisted straight lines. I chose paths that allowed adjustment without commitment. Every decision remained provisional. I avoided landmarks, favoring cover over efficiency. The goal wasn't arrival, it was repositioning. Progress came easier than expected at first. Ground held. Visibility stayed limited. The plan absorbed minor deviations without collapse. That early smoothness tempted reinterpretation. I pushed back against it, forcing myself to assume conditions would worsen rather than improve. They did. Movement appeared where I hadn't anticipated it. Not directly in my path, but close enough to force alteration. I paused longer than I wanted, letting others pass without contact. Their pace suggested urgency without coordination. That told me enough. I adjusted course again, sacrificing distance for discretion. The environment resisted prolonged planning. Routes that looked viable narrowed quickly. Noise traveled unpredictably. Each choice demanded recalculation. The plan held, but only because it was flexible enough to bend without breaking. That flexibility cost time, and time carried exposure. At one point, I stopped entirely and waited, not because I was blocked, but because momentum had begun to outpace awareness. That pause mattered. It reset decision-making, pulling me out of reaction. When I moved again, it was slower, but more controlled. I never reached the destination I'd initially outlined. That wasn't failure, it was correction. Plans built under collapse don't succeed by completion. They succeed by preventing worse outcomes. I ended the movement earlier than intended, choosing a position that offered concealment and observation without commitment. From there, I reassessed. The lighthouse was no longer behind me as a fallback. It was behind me as a coordinate. I could return if conditions demanded it, but returning would be a decision, not default behavior. That distinction mattered more than distance covered. The plan hadn't delivered certainty. It had delivered clarity. Mobility introduced complexity, but it also restored agency. I wasn't waiting for consequences anymore. I was managing them in real time. What almost failed wasn't the execution. It was my initial expectation that departure would resolve pressure. It didn't. It redistributed it. But redistribution was preferable to concentration. Pressure spread thin can be negotiated. Pressure concentrated eventually collapses structure. When I finally settled into temporary stillness, it felt earned rather than imposed. I hadn't escaped the lighthouse. I had released it from the center of my thinking. That shift was the real objective, even if I hadn't named it at the start. Leaving the light behind didn't end responsibility. It changed its shape. Responsibility was no longer tied to a structure or a beam. It was tied to choice, made repeatedly, without ceremony, in a world that no longer rewarded permanence. The plan almost worked in the way plans usually do under collapse. It didn't solve the problem. It prevented a worse one from forming. And in that context, that was enough to justify the risk I'd taken. I didn't leave the lighthouse behind in the way I expected. Distance didn't erase it. Time didn't either. It followed me as a reference point rather than a destination, a fixed idea in a world that had shed most of them. I stopped thinking of it as shelter or responsibility. It became context, a marker for who I had been when stability still felt like something you could restore. From where I settled, I could no longer see the tower, but I could feel its absence. Not as loss, but as release. Decisions stopped orbiting a single structure. I wasn't calculating how to protect it, power it, or justify staying. My thinking widened. Survival expanded from maintenance into movement, observation into response. The habits the lighthouse had taught me didn't disappear. They adapted. Attention to detail remained. So did patience, but they detached from stone and steel and attached themselves to terrain, timing, and people. I no longer waited for systems to function. I assumed they wouldn't and planned accordingly. I understood then that the lighthouse had never been the plan. It had been a transition, a place that slowed the world enough for me to notice collapse before it pressed directly against me. Height had given me early awareness. Isolation had bought me time. Neither was permanent, but both mattered. What surprised me most was the absence of regret. I didn't miss the beam or the work left unfinished. Restoration belonged to a version of the world that assumed continuity. That assumption no longer held. Letting go wasn't failure. It was alignment with reality. The coast continued changing without regard for what I'd invested in it. Weather reshaped access. Movement reshaped risk. People reshaped boundaries. Nothing waited for consensus. That indifference clarified priorities. Survival wasn't about preserving symbols. It was about staying responsive as conditions shifted. I encountered others after leaving, briefly and cautiously. Some moved fast and burned out. Others clung to fixed points longer than they should have. I recognized pieces of myself in both approaches and adjusted without judgment. Everyone was negotiating the same collapse with different timing. At night, I sometimes thought about the lighthouse standing dark against the shoreline. Not as a beacon, but as a silhouette. A reminder that permanence is conditional. Structures outlast intentions, but they don't outlast relevance. What I became wasn't hardened or detached. I became precise. I measured effort against outcome. I avoided commitments that couldn't flex. I treated visibility as liability and mobility as currency. Those shifts didn't make life easier. They made it survivable. The world didn't stabilize after I left. It didn't need to. Stability was no longer the goal. Continuity was. The ability to adapt without erasing yourself in the process. The lighthouse had taught me that through contrast, not instruction. If someone ever finds this account, I don't want it read as warning or lesson. It's simply record. A description of how one fixed point stopped being useful and how letting it go allowed everything else to realign. The light is still there, whether it turns on again or not. Its value changed. So did mine. And in that change, I learned that survival isn't about holding on to what once worked. It's about recognizing when something has already served its purpose and stepping forward without waiting for permission.